He was a veteran of the Coast Guard who thought the hardest rescues were behind her. Her dog had saved lives before, but this time it stopped her in the middle of a quiet forest. Buried beneath mud and broken trees was something no official record wanted to remember. A ship, a list of names, and a past that refused to stay silent. What they uncovered would force one woman to face the moment she arrived too late and choose differently this time. Some instincts don't come from training. They come from something higher guiding us when we least expect it. Early autumn in the northern United States carried a particular kind of clarity. The air was cool and sharp, scented with pine resin and the faint mineral smell of the lake. Sunlight filtered through tall evergreens in pale golden shafts, cutting through morning mist that clung to the forest floor like something reluctant to leave. Somewhere beyond the trees, the lake stretched flat and cold, its surface reflecting the sky in shades of steel and silver. Claire Ashford moved through that brightness like a woman learning to trust it again. She was 43, 5'8", with shoulders that carried the compact strength of someone who had spent years pulling bodies from cold water and making decisions measured in seconds. Her hair was dark brown, pulled into a practical ponytail that showed threads of early gray she didn't bother hiding. Her face was angular, weathered by wind and sun, with lines at the corners of her eyes that came from squinting into distant horizons, not from laughter. Her eyes were the kind people remembered later. Blue-gray, deep watchful, holding the careful distance of someone who had seen what happens when you arrive 5 minutes too late. She wore no makeup. She didn't measure life in appearances. She measured it in choices and the weight of consequences that followed. Today's assignment, if it could be called that, was simple enough. Post-storm trail inspection, check for washouts, fallen trees, unstable ground. The kind of work people described as peaceful. Claire had learned that peaceful didn't always mean easy. Sometimes peace was just quiet enough for the past to get loud. She wore clothing like armor against memory. An olive green field jacket that had seen weather and didn't complain, dark navy cargo pants with pockets that still held a folding knife, and a small flashlight out of habit, and a red and black flannel shirt underneath that provided a flash of warmth against the cool forest tones. Her brown leather boots were scuffed and broken in by miles of shoreline and deck work. On her left wrist sat a simple dive watch, still waterproof to 200 meters, even though she hadn't been in the water in years. On her right hip, clipped to her belt, was a radio that connected her to the ranger station and the quiet voice of Nora Hale, her supervisor. Beside her walked Ranger. Ranger was a German shepherd, 7 years old, retired from active duty, but moving like he still had orders to follow. He was all controlled power balanced on strong shoulders and lean haunches, quick reflexes wrapped in discipline. His coat was short and dense black along the saddle of his back, rich tan on his legs, chest, and face. The fur looked designed for bad weather and worse nights, sleek when dry, darker when wet. His ears stood alert, rotating toward sounds Claire couldn't hear. His eyes were dark brown and intelligent, the kind that didn't just see things, they evaluated them. Ranger was not a pet. He had never been a pet. He was a working dog who understood the difference between play and purpose, and right now his purpose was clear. He was walking point, scanning the trail ahead with the same focus he'd once used searching for survivors in storm-torn waters. Ranger had been trained by a man named Daniel Carrion, a Coast Guard K-9 handler who believed dogs were partners, not tools. Daniel had taught Ranger to track scent through rain and wind, to locate bodies submerged in cold water, to alert without panic, and to trust his nose even when his eyes saw nothing. Daniel had died 3 years ago in a training accident involving a capsized vessel in conditions that should have been routine. Ranger had been there. Ranger had tried. Claire didn't know all the details. The official report said equipment failure. But she'd seen the way Ranger sometimes stared at water with an intensity that looked like mourning, and she understood enough. Some losses didn't need explanations. They just needed acknowledgement. She'd been paired with Ranger 8 months ago after the dog had spent a year in a Coast Guard kennel with no new handler willing to take him. Too old, they said, too specialized, too haunted by whatever he'd seen. Claire had taken him because she understood all 3 of those problems personally, and because when she'd met him in that kennel, he'd looked at her with eyes that said the same thing hers did. I'm still here. I still have work to do. They reached a junction where the maintained hiking trail met a rougher service path used by rangers and maintenance crews. A wooden sign pointed hikers back toward the main loop. Beneath it, a newer notice had been stapled over older wood, the edges bright orange and urgent. Closed. Ground instability. No entry. Claire slowed. She didn't like signs that looked like they'd been put up after someone had already learned the lesson the hard way. Her gaze moved past the barrier to the slope beyond, where the forest dipped into a shallow valley, cluttered with fallen branches, exposed roots, and dark patches of saturated earth that glistened even in the dry autumn air. Ranger stopped. Not a casual pause. A full stop. His head lowered slightly, ears angling forward, chest going still, as if the forest had whispered a code word only he understood. His entire body tightened, muscles coiling beneath the black and tan fur. Claire's hand instinctively moved to the leash, though it hung slack between them. Ranger had never needed a tight leash. He operated on trust, not restraint. "What is it, buddy?" she asked quietly. Ranger didn't glance at her. His attention was fixed on the restricted area on the edge, where the ground dipped and the trees leaned at odd angles, their roots half exposed like fingers clawing at air. He sniffed once slow and deliberate, nostrils flaring as he sampled something in the air that Claire couldn't detect. Then he pulled gently at the leash, just enough to ask a question. "Can we go there?" Claire's humor, when it appeared, tended to arrive dry and tired. "You know we're retired, right? We're supposed to be afraid of paperwork now, not the woods." Ranger gave her nothing but that hard, focused stare into the trees. His tail was low and steady, not tucked in fear, not wagging in excitement, just anchored, ready. Claire hesitated. Her instincts were a strange blend now. Half the cautious procedure of her new job, checking boxes and following protocols designed to keep liability lawyers happy. Half the old Coast Guard reflex that always wanted to confirm the unknown before it became a body count. She pulled out her phone and marked a GPS waypoint at the closure sign. Then she took a photo of the orange notice and the hollow beyond it, the image capturing the angle of the slope and the dark earth that looked too soft, too hungry. She lifted the radio mic clipped to her shoulder. "Ranger Station, this is Ashford. I'm at the North Junction near the closure sign. I've got something off trail, requesting details on the restricted zone." The radio crackled. A man's voice came through, calm and rehearsed, the sound of someone who'd repeated the same warnings for years and stopped expecting anyone to listen. "Copy Ashford. Restricted zone is active. Ground instability, sinkhole risk. Do not enter. Log your position and continue patrol." Claire's jaw tightened slightly. "Any recent incidents I should know about?" A pause. Not long, but long enough to feel like someone checking which version of the truth was safest to share. "Negative on recent incidents. But the area is unstable. We don't want anyone getting hurt." Claire looked at Ranger. The dog's body remained taut, nose angled toward the hollow like a compass needle refusing to be ignored. His breathing had changed slower, deeper, as if he were sorting through layers of scent the way a detective sorted through evidence. "Understood," Claire said into the mic. She clipped it back to her shoulder. For a moment, she stood there listening. Birdsong threaded through the pines, finches and jays calling to each other in sharp, bright notes. Wind moved through the branches with a soft, rushing sound, like an old lullaby. The lake in the distance threw flashes of silver light between the tree trunks. Everything looked harmless, autumnal, postcard perfect. And yet Claire felt it, the faint pressure behind her ribs. The sensation of an invisible hand resting on her sternum, light but insistent. The old feeling. The one that said, "This is the moment. Choose wisely." She spoke quietly, as if the forest itself might overhear and judge her. 50 yards, she told Ranger. "We confirm what you're smelling, and then we're out." "Deal." Ranger's tail stayed low and steady. No excitement, no fear, just purpose. They stepped off the maintained trail. The ground softened almost immediately, spongy, with damp leaf litter and decomposing wood. Claire placed her boots carefully, eyes scanning for obvious hazards. Sinkholes, hollow ground roots that could snap an ankle. Ranger moved ahead by a few feet, leash slack but never loose, guiding with subtle confidence. Then Claire noticed something strange. Ranger wasn't tracking the way dogs usually did. He wasn't zigzagging wildly, letting his nose sweep in broad arcs. He was moving in a straight, thoughtful line, pausing occasionally to sample the air, like a sommelier tasting something rare and specific. His head lifted, nostrils, working, then lowered again as he adjusted his trajectory by a few degrees. Claire's mind snagged on a memory she didn't want. Salt spray on her lips, the sharp tar and diesel scent of a working dock. The smell of old rope left too long in seawater, fibers rotting from the inside out. A smell from another world, another life. Why would a forest smell like a harbor? Ranger stopped near a patch of moss and decaying leaves. He pawed at the ground, careful, controlled. No frantic digging, just enough pressure to peel back the wet layer, like turning a page in a book someone had tried to bury. Something dark and smooth appeared beneath the leaves. Claire crouched beside him and brushed the debris away with her gloved hand. The object was wood-carved, weathered by time and moisture, into something that felt both ancient and deliberate. It held a smell that didn't belong this far inland. Hardened pitch, faint brine, the ghost of water that had traveled too far from the sea. Claire's stomach tightened. She lifted the piece, turning it over in her hands. Along one edge, faint etched lines formed a pattern, curves and flourishes that resembled waves or perhaps the decorative scrollwork of a ship's ornamentation. The kind of detail shipwrights used to add beauty to vessels that spent their lives doing hard, ugly work. Ranger stared at the wood without blinking. His ears were forward, his body still as if he were standing guard over something sacred. Claire swallowed. Her throat felt dry. This isn't from around here. And that's when the forest did something that made her skin go cold. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of a sound. A single soft metallic note drifted through the air, distant and muffled, as if something small had tapped a bell far away and the echo had taken 40 years to arrive. Claire froze, holding her breath to listen harder. The birds continued singing. The wind continued moving. Nothing else changed. Ranger's head snapped up. His ears angled sharply toward the hollow, and his body went rigid, every muscle locking into place, as if someone had called his name in a language only he understood. Claire's pulse quickened. She'd heard imagined noises before. PTSD had a cruel talent for conjuring sounds that weren't there. Gunshots that were actually car doors. Screams that were actually gulls. But this felt different. This didn't feel like her mind playing tricks. This felt like an invitation. Ranger stepped forward again, tugging the leash with quiet insistence. Claire rose slowly. Her mind argued with itself in clean, logical sentences. The sign says closed. The radio says don't enter. The ground can collapse. This job is supposed to keep people safe, not put you in danger. And then another voice, older and rougher, whispered through the logic like smoke through a screen door. If you turn away from the wrong thing, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you chose comfort over truth. She tightened her grip on the leash. All right, she said softly, not entirely sure who she was speaking to. The dog herself or something larger that seemed to be watching. We look, we don't stay. They moved deeper. The hollow widened into a shallow valley where the trees leaned at strange angles, their roots half exposed and twisted, like arthritic fingers. The air felt cooler here, heavier, as if the temperature dropped with every step away from sunlight. Claire's phone GPS blinked uncertainly, the signal weak, the blue dot wandering across the screen, as if embarrassed to admit it didn't know where they were. A fallen tangle of branches blocked part of the view ahead. Ranger navigated around it with the ease of long practice, then stopped abruptly at the edge of a slope. Claire stepped beside him, and there it was. At first, her brain refused to label what she was seeing. It looked like a curve of ancient bone or the ribbed spine of something mythic that had died and been half swallowed by the earth. Then her eyes found the shape, traced the line, recognized the unmistakable geometry. A bow, a ship's bow, wooden massive scarred by decades of rot and moisture. The timbers were dark, almost black, split in places where water and ice had worked into the grain and expanded. Rusted metal straps hugged the structure like remnants of armor bolts and fittings that had once held planks together, now brown with oxidation and barely clinging to their purpose. It sat in the sunken valley as if the earth had tried to swallow it and failed, like a giant creature caught mid-breath, frozen in the act of drowning in soil instead of water. A ship in the forest. Claire's mouth went dry. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. Flood, no flood could carry a vessel this size this far inland. Historical Yashi. The forest around it was old growth, untouched for a century at least. This thing had been here longer than the trees that now leaned against it. Ranger lowered his head, not in fear but in a controlled, trained posture Claire recognized immediately. The stance of a working dog encountering an unknown threat. Readiness that was also respect. He wasn't alerting to danger, he was acknowledging presence. Claire stared, unable to move for several seconds. Something inside her shifted, something long locked up and covered over with procedure and routine, and the deliberate numbness that came from choosing not to feel too much. She felt the sharp edge of the past press against the present. Not like a weapon, but like a key turning in an old lock. She didn't know why this thing existed here. She didn't know who had put it here or how long it had been waiting, patient and silent beneath mud and leaves and the slow accumulation of forgetting. But she felt it clear as a hand on her shoulder. This wasn't simply a discovery. This was a summons. And if she walked away now, the forest would remain bright and beautiful and indifferent, while something important stayed buried, patient until it found someone else willing to listen. Claire's voice came out quieter than she intended, almost reverent. "You didn't lead me wrong," she whispered to Ranger. Ranger didn't look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the ship as if guarding a doorway only he understood. And in the cool autumn sunlight, with the lake glittering somewhere beyond the pines, and the wind moving through branches that had kept this secret for 40 years, Claire Ashford felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not peace, not certainty, but the unmistakable beginning of purpose. She stood there for another moment, memorizing the shape of the bow, the angle of the timbers, the way rust and rot had claimed what water couldn't finish. Then she pulled out her phone and took photographs, careful to capture every detail. The curve of the hull, the metal fittings, the way the earth had partially reclaimed the wood moss growing in the seams like stitches trying to close a wound. Ranger shifted beside her, his weight leaning slightly into her leg. Not for comfort, but for connection. A reminder that whatever this was, they were facing it together. Claire crouched and ran her gloved hand along one of the exposed timbers. The wood was cold slick with moisture, softer than it should have been. Decades of slow decay had left it spongy, in places firm in others, like a body in the late stages of returning to the earth. She found more carvings. Faint lines and patterns etched into the wood near what would have been the waterline. Decorative work, the kind sailors added during long voyages to pass time and mark their presence. Names maybe, dates, prayers. Her fingers traced one set of letters barely visible beneath grime and age. Northern. She stopped breathing. Northern. She wiped more dirt away, heart hammering now, and found the rest. Northern Star, 1984, 40 years old. This ship had been here hidden in this valley for 40 years. Claire's mind did the math automatically. 1984, the year she was 3 years old, the year the Cold War was still grinding on the year before cell phones and GPS and the digital systems that made hiding something this size almost impossible. A ship could vanish in 1984. Records could be lost or never filed. People could disappear, and if no one looked hard enough, they stayed disappeared. Ranger let out a low sound. Not a growl, not a whine. Something in between. A restrained vocalization that vibrated with tension, as if he were trying to speak a warning his vocal cords couldn't form. Claire looked at him. The dog's ears were pinned back slightly. His eyes locked on a section of the hull where the timbers had collapsed inward, creating a dark opening like a mouth. "What do you smell?" she asked quietly. Ranger didn't answer, of course, but his posture said everything. He smelled something that mattered, something human or something that had been human once. Claire's hand moved instinctively to her radio, then stopped. If she called this in now, they'd pull her off the site, cordon it off. Bring in officials who would spend weeks deciding whose jurisdiction this fell under, whose budget would cover the investigation, whose career would benefit from the discovery. And in the meantime, the story would stay buried. The names on that list she'd found, 23 people, would stay lost. She made a decision. "Not yet," she whispered more to herself than to Ranger. "Not until we know what we're dealing with." She took more photographs, wide shots of the entire structure, close-ups of the carved name, the metal fittings, the collapsed section that led into darkness. She documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who knew evidence mattered, who understood that details separated truth from speculation. When she was finished, she stood and took one last look at the Northern Star. It sat there like a monument to something that had never been mourned, a grave without a headstone, a disaster without a memorial. Claire felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders, heavy and cold and impossible to shrug off. "Come on," she said to Ranger. "We need to go." They walked back the way they'd come, following their own footprints through the soft earth. Ranger moved more slowly now, glancing back over his shoulder every few steps as if making sure the ship wasn't following. When they reached the closure sign, Claire stopped and did the boring, necessary work that kept people alive and investigations credible. She logged the GPS coordinates in her phone. She attached the photographs to a digital report. She added a note in careful, neutral language. "Discovered unusual structure approximately 50 yards into restricted zone. Appears to be remnants of watercraft, age unknown. Recommend qualified assessment of site integrity and historical significance." She keyed her item. "Ashford to Ranger Station. I'm back at the closure sign. I've documented an anomaly in the restricted area. Recommend supervisory review." Static. Then the dispatcher's voice, flat and unremarkable. "Copy. Supervisor will be notified." Claire waited for follow-up questions. What kind of anomaly? How serious do we need to escalate? But none came. The silence on the line felt like a door closing gently but firmly. "Understood," she said, and clipped the mic back to her shoulder. She turned toward the main trail, ready to continue her patrol and pretend the last 30 minutes hadn't rewritten her understanding of what was possible. But Ranger didn't move. The dog stood fixed at the edge of the closure boundary, ears up, body angled toward the hidden valley. His tail was low and steady, not tucked, not aggressive. Just anchored, like a soldier refusing to accept a retreat as the final order. Claire sighed. "I know," she murmured, "but we're not doing hero work today." Ranger's gaze didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened, like he was staring at a closing door and calculating whether he could reach it before it locked. The sound of boots on gravel made Claire turn. A woman was walking toward them with the decisive pace of someone who had spent years managing other people's mistakes and emergencies. She was in her late 30s, tall and wiry, with a posture that suggested she'd learned to stand firm against weather, stubborn hikers, and bureaucrats who didn't understand how forests actually worked. Her hair was sandy blonde, pulled into a practical braid beneath a Forest Service cap. Freckles dusted her fair skin, faint now in autumn, but probably vivid in summer. Her eyes were hazel alert, holding the guarded patience of someone who knew the woods could be both beautiful and cruel sometimes in the same afternoon. She wore the uniform of the local ranger authority. Green shirt, utility belt, radio, clipped high on her chest. The name tag read Nora Hale, Claire's supervisor. "Claire Ashford," Nora called as she approached, her voice carrying the flat Midwestern accent of someone who'd grown up in cold climates and practical households. "That's me," Claire replied. Nora's gaze dropped to Ranger. The dog didn't bark, didn't wag. He simply watched her with calm appraisal, the way a professional evaluates another professional. "That's your K9, Nora said. Not quite a question. Was, Claire corrected, then softer. "He still thinks it's his job." Nora's mouth tightened in what might have been a smile if it trusted the world more. Sometimes they're right. She stopped near the closure sign and glanced at the orange notice. The expression on her face shifted. Subtle, but Claire caught it. Not surprise. Resignation. The look of someone who'd been expecting this conversation eventually and had been hoping it wouldn't come during her shift. "I got your report," Nora said. "Unusual structure." Claire nodded. "Approximately 50 yards in. Wooden hull partially buried. Abayamandim. Carved name says Northern Star, dated 1984. Nora's eyes narrowed slightly. She looked past Claire toward the restricted zone, as if she could see through the trees to the thing Claire had described. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped half an octave. "You went into the closure area." It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement and maybe a test. "Close to the boundary," Claire said carefully. "Not into the soft center." The dog alerted. I confirmed visually and retreated. Nora studied her for a long moment, measuring how much truth Claire could handle or how much trouble she was willing to become. "Walk with me," Nora said finally. They moved a few steps to where the forest opened just enough to overlook the start of the hollow. Nora kept a careful distance from the sloped toes angled away from the soft edge. She'd done this before, Claire realized. More times than she wished. "This isn't just a sinkhole," Nora said quietly. "It's what we call a kettle bog valley. Water table sits high year-round. Ground shifts seasonally. Spring thaw makes it aggressive." "Aggressive," Claire repeated. Nora nodded, once her gaze still on the hollow. "That's what the locals call it, because it takes things." She didn't say people. She didn't have to. Ranger's ears flicked forward. His nose lifted and sampled the air, then lowered again in a restless rhythm that felt like the dog arguing with reality. Claire cleared her throat. "Is that why the closure was posted?" Nora's gaze shifted back to her. "Yes, and because the county doesn't want another lawsuit." Her voice was blunt, but there was something underneath it. An old fatigue. A bruise that didn't show until you pressed the right spot. Claire's jaw tightened. "Another." Nora's eyes held hers for a beat longer than was comfortable. "You weren't here then." Before Claire could ask what she meant, the sound of a vehicle approaching cut through the quiet. Tires crunched over gravel, steady and deliberate. An unmarked SUV, dark blue and clean, rolled to a stop near the trail junction. The driver's door opened with a sharp, purposeful swing. A woman stepped out, moving with the controlled economy of motion Claire recognized immediately. Someone who carried authority like a tool, not a decoration. She was medium height, solidly built, with dark brown hair, cut to her jaw and tucked behind her ears. Her skin was fair, lightly freckled, and her face was composed in the way law enforcement faces often became, expression reduced to what was useful. A faint scar traced the edge of her left eyebrow, thin as a pencil line, the kind you got from something sharp in close quarters. Her eyes were brown and direct, the kind that didn't linger on scenery. She wore plainclothes jeans and a dark jacket, but the badge clipped at her belt flashed when the sun caught it. Her hands were bare and steady, no jewelry except a simple silver band on her right ring finger. Nora's shoulders tightened slightly. Deputy Brennan. The woman approached with her gaze sweeping from Nora to Claire to Ranger. When she looked at Ranger, her expression flickered with something that might have been respect, or caution, or both. The look of someone who'd met working dogs before and learned not to underestimate them. Claire Ashford, the woman said. Her voice was firm low with the small-town authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. That's me, Claire replied. The woman stopped near the closure sign and scanned the area with eyes that were already building a mental report. I'm Deputy Kate Brennan, County Sheriff's Office. Claire gave a short nod. Deputy, Kate's attention shifted to the restricted zone, then back to Claire. Ranger Station Dispatch said you went near the boundary. Near, Claire confirmed, not into. Kate's eyes narrowed a fraction. And you saw something. It wasn't a question. Nora shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. Claire noticed that. Nora wasn't surprised Kate was here. That meant this place had a history with the sheriff's office. A history that involved more than geology. Claire chose her words carefully. I documented unusual material near the edge. I'm requesting a proper site evaluation. Kate's gaze dropped to Ranger, who stood like a statue carved from discipline and purpose. Your dog wants in there, she observed quietly. He wants answers, Claire said. Kate made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Dry-tired, the sound of someone who'd heard that sentiment before and knew how it usually ended. Don't we all? She stepped closer to the sign and tapped it once with her finger. The metal made a hollow sound. This closure isn't optional, she said. Not because I enjoy telling people what to do. It's because the last time someone decided a warning sign was a suggestion, we spent 3 days in the mud and came back with nothing to show but grief. The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water. Claire felt her chest tighten. Someone died. Kate didn't flinch. She nodded once, slow and deliberate. Yes. Nora's jaw flexed. She looked away toward the trees as if the forest had personally offended her, and she was still deciding whether to forgive it. Claire felt the old pressure behind her ribs again. The sensation of being seconds away from a decision that would outlive her. The moment before action, when everything was still possible and nothing was certain. Kate kept talking matter of fact, the voice of someone who'd made too many reports about preventable tragedies. Hiker, couple years back. Local guy thought he could shortcut through here, see what the old stories were about. Slipped off the edge. The bog doesn't let go once it has you. We tried. Her voice didn't waver, but something in her eyes dimmed. God knows we tried. Ranger's ears pinned back for half a second, then lifted again. His body remained still, but his breathing changed. Shorter, sharper. He wasn't panicking. He was listening, processing information the way canines were trained to do, filing it away in whatever framework dogs use to understand human tragedy. Kate noticed. He gets like that when you talk about it. Only when something feels familiar, Claire said quietly. Nora's gaze snapped back. Familiar how? Claire hesitated. If she told them about the ship-shaped structure, about the carved name, and the date that placed it 40 years in the past, she risked sounding like a woman seeing ghosts in the woods, chasing legends that locals had probably whispered about for decades without proof. But she also risked withholding information that could matter. Information that might explain why a man had died trying to find something everyone said didn't exist. She chose the middle path, truth without embellishment. There's debris, she said, old wood, carved, smells like pitch, like marine sealant, the kind of preservation work you'd find on watercraft. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things no one wanted to say out loud. Nora's expression went carefully neutral, the mask of someone whose job required her to dismiss impossible things with bureaucratic efficiency. That's not possible. But Kate's eyes didn't widen with surprise. Instead, they sharpened as if Claire had just said a word that fit into a puzzle Kate had been working on for years but never admitted she had. What kind of carving? Kate asked, her voice quieter now, almost careful. Claire pictured the scrollwork, the deliberate curves that suggested craftsmanship and purpose. Decorative, the kind you'd see on older vessels. Passenger ships, maybe from before everything was fiberglass and steel. Kate's hand hovered near her radio, not touching it yet, but close. Ready. You kept a sample. Claire nodded. Bagged and logged. Nora let out a slow breath, the sound of air leaving a tire that had been holding pressure for too long. Claire, she said, and her voice carried a warning wrapped in concern, this area has stories. People talk, but the woods make fools out of folks who chase legends instead of facts. Claire's humor surfaced thin and tired as old paint. I'm not chasing legends. I'm trying to keep people from dying. Kate's expression softened by a fraction at that, just enough for Claire to see the human being behind the badge. Then you'll listen when I tell you, Kate said, her voice firm, but not unkind. You do not go back in there, not alone, not with the dog, not because you've got the skill set or the stubbornness. You don't go. Claire nodded once. She meant it. Mostly. Ranger, however, didn't look convinced. His nose lifted again toward the hidden valley, and his body leaned forward, almost imperceptibly, drawn by something Claire couldn't see or smell or understand. But she trusted it anyway because Ranger had never been wrong about the things that mattered. Kate watched the dog with the expression of someone reading a language they didn't speak fluently, but recognized as important. He's trained, she said. He is, Claire replied. Trained dogs don't get restless without a reason. Kate turned to Nora. We need to double the barriers. Nora frowned. It's just ground instability. The sign is enough. Kate's mouth tightened, and for the first time Claire saw real emotion crack through the professional mask. Anger, maybe, or grief that had aged into something harder. It wasn't enough last time. The three of them stood there in an uneasy triangle beneath the cool autumn sun, each anchored by their own kind of memory. Claire by war, by the people she hadn't saved in time. Nora by years of rescues that succeeded and the few that didn't. Kate by the weight of a death she'd had to document in ink to turn into paperwork that made tragedy sound routine. And Ranger by something older than any of them. Something that lived in scent and instinct and the unshakable certainty that some places held stories the living were obligated to finish. A sudden gust of wind blew up from the hollow, cold and sharp. It wasn't strong, just a breath of air rising from below, but it carried a smell so specific that Claire felt it snag behind her eyes like a fishhook. Tar, wet timber, and something faintly metallic like old coins left too long in seawater. Ranger reacted instantly. He stopped breathing for a beat, body frozen mid-inhale. Then he let out a low sound, not a growl, not a bark. A restrained whine that vibrated through his chest with the tension of something barely controlled. His paws shifted in the dirt, claws scratching for purchase against instinct. And then he did something that made Claire's blood run cold. He sat, perfectly, precisely. The formal alert posture of a working canine who had found what he'd been trained to find. Then he lifted his head toward the hollow and held absolutely still, as if waiting for a command that hadn't been given yet, as if waiting for permission to do what he already knew needed to be done. Kate's gaze snapped to the dog. What is that? Claire swallowed against the sudden dryness in her throat. That's his alert posture. Nora stared. Alert for what? Claire didn't answer immediately because the truth was unsettling and hard to say out loud without sounding like she'd lost her grip on reality. Ranger only sat like that when he had found something he believed mattered more than his own safety. Something that required human attention, human action, human witness. Kate stepped closer, her voice dropping low. Ashford, tell me what you're not telling me. Claire looked down at Ranger. The dog's eyes were fixed on the trees, unblinking, devoted. Not afraid, not confused, devout. She felt the old sense of being watched return stronger now, not by the forest but by the past itself, by something patient that didn't care about posted signs or legal jurisdictions or the small human decisions that tried to keep chaos contained. She raised her head and met Kate's eyes in Mahama. I'm telling you everything I'm sure of, she said quietly, and there's one thing I'm absolutely sure of. What? Claire's voice dropped almost reverent. He's not wrong. The moment held taut as wire until the wind eased and the smell faded back into the ordinary sense of pine and earth and cold water somewhere in the distance. Ranger stood again as if nothing had happened, but Claire knew something had shifted, not in the ground, in the story. And stories, once they started telling themselves, didn't stop until they reached the end. By late afternoon, Nora had arranged for additional warning tape and scheduled a geotechnical assessment. Something official. Something that could be written down and filed away in reports that made uncomfortable discoveries sound routine. Kate made several calls from her SUV, speaking in short phrases that sounded like procedure and caution, wrapped in the language of liability. Claire kept her hands busy. She repacked the bagged wood sample tightened straps on her field jacket, checked the radio battery. Small tasks that kept her mind from spiraling into the questions that had no immediate answers. When Kate returned, her expression was set like concrete. Professional. Careful. The face of someone who'd learned to navigate the space between what people wanted to hear and what they needed to know. We'll handle this by the book, Kate said, her voice carrying the flat authority of official procedure. Tomorrow I'll bring someone from the county who knows unstable terrain. Nora will have her crew here. You'll be present only if you agree to follow instructions to the letter. Claire nodded. Understood. Kate's eyes studied her a moment longer, as if trying to decide whether Claire was the kind of person who obeyed rules or the kind who obeyed conscience when the two came into conflict. I've met people like you, she said finally. The ones who think doing the right thing means doing it alone. That's how people die. Claire's throat tightened. She thought of faces she rarely let herself name. Young faces. Faces that had trusted her to make the right call at the right time. I'm not trying to be a hero, she said quietly. Kate's gaze flickered, something human showing through the professional mask. Good, she said, because heroes make terrible witnesses. And this place already has enough ghosts. Nora returned from the trail junction carrying fresh tape and a portable barrier panel. She worked quickly, efficiently, no wasted movement, no sentimental pauses. When she finished, she wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cool air and looked at Claire with tired eyes that had seen too many people underestimate the woods. You're new here, Nora said, so let me say this plainly. The forest doesn't care about your past. It doesn't care about your training, and it doesn't care about your dog's instincts. Claire almost smiled. Almost. And you do. Nora's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite humor. I care about not finding another body. The honesty hit harder than comfort would have. Claire nodded once, accepting the warning for what it was. Kindness disguised as bluntness. As they prepared to leave, Ranger paused at the closure sign one final time. He didn't pull against the leash. He simply stood and stared toward the hidden valley ears, forward, breathing slow and deliberate. His tail remained low and steady, not tucked, in fear, not wagging in anticipation, just present, witnessing. Claire followed his gaze and felt a shiver of something she didn't have a name for. Not fear, not excitement, recognition. That evening, Claire returned to the small rental cabin she'd been staying in near the lake. The place was simple. Pine walls that still smelled faintly of resin and old smoke. A wood stove in the corner that worked when you remembered to clean the flue. Two windows that looked out over water that changed color with the light steel gray and morning silver, in afternoon black at night. She fed Ranger first the way she always did. Measured his kibble, checked his water. Ran her hands over his legs and paws looking for cuts or thorns or the small injuries working dogs ignored until someone made them stop and rest. His right hind leg felt warm to the touch. Not hot, not swollen, but warmer than it should have been. She pressed gently along the muscle and Ranger's ear flicked, the only sign he'd felt anything. You pushed it today, she said quietly. Ranger looked at her with dark eyes that didn't apologize and didn't complain. Just acknowledged. Yes, and I'd do it again. She gave him a low-dose anti-inflammatory hidden in a piece of cheese, then laid out her own gear in neat, unconscious lines across the small table. Knife, flashlight, radiophone, the bagged wood sample. Everything organized the way military training had taught her, the way habit reinforced even after the uniform came off. When she finally lay down on the narrow bed, exhaustion came quickly, but sleep did not bring rest. In the darkness behind her closed eyes, she dreamed. Not of the forest, not of the ship buried in mud and time. She dreamed of water. Cold water, black as oil, rising faster than hands could work. The hull of a fishing vessel taking on water through a crack no one had seen until it was too late. Radio chatter, voices overlapping, coordinates being called out in the clipped syntax of emergency. She was younger in the dream. 35, still wearing the Coast Guard uniform, still believing that speed and skill and procedure could save anyone if you just moved fast enough and didn't hesitate. The helicopter rotor beat the air above her. Rescue swimmer in the water. Two people pulled up, already hypothermic but breathing, and then the call. One more still down there. She'd hesitated. 5 seconds, maybe 10. Checking the fuel gauge, calculating the weight, running the numbers that said they were at the edge of safe operating limits. The correct decision, the smart decision, the decision that kept her crew alive. And in those 10 seconds, the water had claimed what it wanted. When they'd found the body 3 days later, washed up on a rocky shore 15 miles south, the coroner said drowning. Quick. The man probably hadn't suffered long, but Claire knew the truth. Suffering wasn't measured in duration. It was measured in the moment you realized no one was coming. The moment hope gave way to cold and acceptance, and the terrible understanding that you were going to die alone. She woke before dawn, hard hammering the taste of salt water in her mouth, even though she was hundreds of miles from the ocean. Ranger was already awake, sitting beside the door, eyes fixed on the window as if the forest outside had spoken again, and he was the only one who could hear it. Claire sat up slowly, wiping sweat from her face with shaking hands. "Yeah," she whispered into the darkness. "I know." She didn't know what "yeah" meant yet, but Ranger did. Morning arrived pale and cold, the kind of autumn light that looked clean but carried winter underneath it. Claire drove the county road that skirted the lake, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind less so. She hadn't told Kate or Nora everything she felt because feelings weren't evidence, and evidence was the only language that kept people alive and investigations credible. Still, something had shifted since yesterday. The woods had taken a step closer, quiet as a predator. And Ranger, normally content to pace the cabin and settle into rest, had sat by the door before dawn, as if he'd been posted there by an unseen sergeant who didn't accept retirement as an excuse. She wore the same outfit as always. Olive field jacket, dark cargo pants, red and black flannel underneath. Weathered brown boots that had walked too many shorelines and carried too many weights. The old dive watch on her wrist ticked steadily, a small stubborn sound that said time kept moving whether you were ready or not. On the passenger seat beside her sat the bagged piece of carved wood sealed in clear evidence plastic like a secret trying to stay contained. Ranger rode with the restraint of a working dog. He didn't press his nose to the window like a pet. He watched the tree line and the water with focused attention, ears rotating toward sounds Claire couldn't hear. His black and tan coat gleamed in stripes where the morning sun hit it through the windshield. Her destination was a small workshop near the lake's western edge, a place the locals called Blackwoods, as if it were a landmark older than the roads that led to it. The building looked like it had grown from the shoreline rather than been built on it. Weathered cedar siding gray with age and weather. A slanted roof patched in places with newer shingles that didn't quite match. The porch was crowded with stacked lumber, sawhorses, and tools arranged in the organized chaos of someone who knew where everything was, even if no one else did. The air around it smelled like sawdust, pine sap varnish, and the faint mineral scent of lake water. An honest smell, uncomplicated. The opposite of the questions churning in Claire's mind. An old man stepped onto the porch before Claire even shut off the engine, as if he'd been expecting her, or as if he simply paid attention to the world in a way most people had forgotten how to do. Vernon Blackwood was in his mid-70s, tall but stooped in the gentle way of someone who'd spent decades bending over workbenches rather than surrendering to age. His hands were large and scarred, knuckles thickened by years of work, fingers stained with oils and wood tannins that no amount of washing could remove. A gray beard framed his mouth, trimmed short enough to stay out of machinery, but long enough to show he didn't care about fashion. His hair was white and wiry, sticking out from under a faded ball cap that had probably been blue once, but was now the color of old denim left in sun. His eyes were what made him memorable, light blue and sharp, with a humor that lived behind them like a lamp in a window, warm but watchful. "Well," Vern said as Claire climbed out, his voice rough as sanded oak, "if it isn't the new ranger and her four-legged supervisor." Claire's mouth twitched. "Morning, Vern." Ranger stepped out and immediately sat alert but polite, his gaze locked on Vern with the evaluating stare of a professional meeting another professional. Not hostile, not friendly, measuring. Vern looked down at the tone with quiet appreciation that didn't need words. Then he spoke to Ranger directly, the way people did when they understood dogs weren't pets, but partners. "That's not a house dog." "No," Claire agreed. "Retired." "Supposed to be." Vern snorted softly, a sound that carried decades of understanding. "Ain't no such thing as retired when you've spent your whole life being useful. Just means the paperwork stopped, not the purpose." Claire felt that sentence land somewhere deep and sore, like a thumb pressed against a bruise she'd been pretending didn't exist. Inside the workshop, dust motes floated through bars of sunlight like slow snow. Tools hung in neat rows on pegboard walls, each outline traced in marker, so you knew where every wrench and chisel belonged. Half-finished canoe paddles leaned against one wall like sleeping sentries. A long wooden boat hull rested upside down on sawhorses, its ribs exposed, beautiful and skeletal. The smell of wood was everywhere. Fresh pine, aged cedar, the sweet scent of maple. Layers of history compressed into air that felt thick enough to taste. Vern didn't waste time with small talk. He nodded at Claire's shoulder bag. "You brought the mystery." Claire pulled out the sealed evidence bag and placed it on the workbench. The carved wood inside looked darker under the fluorescent shop lights, its etched lines more visible now, the pattern of waves or scrollwork standing out against the weathered grain. Vern washed his hands at a small sink in the corner, then put on thin work gloves as if the object might be fragile or sacred or both. He opened the bag with careful fingers, lifted the wood and held it close to his face. His eyes narrowed. He didn't just look. He listened with his fingertips tracing the grain the way a blind person might read Braille. For a moment, the old man's usual humor vanished completely. He became something else. Quiet, focused, reverent. Claire recognized that posture. It was the same posture Ranger wore when the world stopped being ordinary and became something that demanded witness. "This isn't trail trash," Vern said, finally his voice low and certain. Claire exhaled slowly. "What is it?" Vern turned the piece under the light, studying the carved scrollwork with the attention of someone who understood that details mattered, that craftsmanship told stories words couldn't. "This is shipwork," he said, "not the kind you buy at a tourist shop or salvage from a decorative rowboat. This was made by somebody who knew what they were doing, somebody who cared." He sniffed the wood, then nodded as if confirming a suspicion his eyes had already formed. "Pitch," he said. "Old pitch, not modern sealant. And you see this curve here?" He traced one finger along the edge where the wood bent in a deliberate arc. "That's decorative, but it's functional too. Keeps water from sitting where it can rot the seams. This is marine carpentry. Real work." Claire leaned closer. "How old?" Vern's mouth tightened into a line that wasn't quite a frown, wasn't quite resignation. "Hard to say without more context, but older than most of the town thinks anything is. This kind of pitchwork, this kind of hand carving." He looked up at her, his light blue eyes serious. "You're talking decades. 40 years, maybe more." 40 years, Claire repeated quietly. The number matched the date carved into the ship's bow. 1984. Vern's gaze sharpened. "Where'd you find it?" Claire chose her words with the same care she'd used crossing ice. "Near a closed area. Ground instability. The dog found it after the storm." Vern looked at Ranger, who stood now, with his head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the wood in Vern's hands, with an intensity that looked almost painful. "He found it," Vern said slowly. "Of course he did." Claire frowned. "You believe that means something." Vern didn't answer immediately. He walked to a shelf, pulled down a small jar of clear liquid, and dabbed a bit onto a clean rag. He wiped the wood gently, and the scent rose sharper now. Tar. Old water. Something faintly metallic like oxidized iron or copper coins left too long in brine. Vern's eyes softened, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its humor. "My father used to tell a story," he said quietly. "Not the kind you read in books. The kind people tell when they've got a fire going and the lake is making noises you can't explain." Claire stayed silent. Ranger remained still like a guard at a threshold no one else could see. Vern continued, his voice carrying the rhythm of someone repeating words he'd heard in childhood and never quite forgotten. He said, "There's a place in these woods where the ground breathes, comes alive in spring when the water table rises, settles in summer when things dry out, and in the fall when the rains come back, it shines, and when it summers, it gives up things it's swallowed. Just a little, like it's tasting the past to see if it still matters." Claire felt her skin tighten along her arms. "A legend," Vern shrugged, setting the wood down gently as if it might shatter under rough handling. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just what people call geology when they don't have the right words for what they're seeing." He tapped the carved wood with one finger. "But this ain't a campfire lie." Claire's mind flashed back to the shape she'd seen in the valley. The curve of the bow, too deliberate to be accident, too massive to be imagination. The name carved into rotting timber. Northern Star, 1984. "This looks like it came off a passenger ship," Vern said, his voice quiet now, almost reluctant. "The kind folks used in the old days back when they hauled people and supplies across water because roads were suggestions and trucks couldn't reach half the places that needed reaching." He traced the scrollwork again, his scarred fingers moving with surprising gentleness. "They decorated even their workhorses back then, put a bit of beauty on hardship, made the crossing feel less like desperation and more like passage." Claire's throat tightened unexpectedly. Beauty on hardship. That sounded like something people did when they didn't think they'd survive without it, when hope was the only cargo that mattered. "So how does a ship piece end up in the woods?" she asked. Vern's faint smile returned, but it wasn't light. It carried weight like a joke that had stopped being funny decades ago. "That's the question that makes people act foolish." Ranger made a quiet sound in the back of his throat. Not a bark, not a whine. A restrained, vibrating noise that said something had stirred him. Something he couldn't name but recognized as important. Vern noticed. "He always do that. Only when something stirs him, Claire said carefully. Vern nodded slowly as if he already understood more than Claire was saying. He reached under the workbench and pulled out a battered tin box, the kind that had once held tobacco or cookies, and now held whatever small things a person couldn't throw away but couldn't quite explain keeping. He opened it and removed a small brass object green with age and oxidation. An old token maybe, or a coin. It had a faint anchor stamped on one side, worn almost smooth by time and handling. Found that down near the marsh 15 years ago, Vern said quietly, placing it on the workbench beside Claire's carved wood. Thought it was junk. Then I cleaned it up and saw the mark. Ranger's reaction was immediate and unsettling. The dog stepped forward, nostrils flaring, as he caught the scent of the brass token. Then, without any command from Claire, without any warning, he backed away. 2 full steps. His hackles rose along his shoulders, not in aggression, but in something that looked uncomfortably like recognition, like fear that had a name. His eyes widened not with the simple startlement of a pet surprised by thunder, but with recognition so intense it looked like pain, like he'd just seen something he'd spent years trying to forget. Claire's pulse jumped. Ranger. The dog didn't break his stare from the brass disc. His breathing turned shallow, measured, as if he were trying not to inhale too much of whatever memory the object carried. His body trembled once, a single controlled shiver, then went rigid. Vern's humor vanished completely. That ain't normal, he murmured. Claire's hand tightened on the leash, though Ranger wasn't pulling. He was frozen, locked in place by something invisible. Her mind raced through possibilities, trying to find logic in the dog's reaction. Ranger had been exposed to explosives, weapons, blood, saltwater fire. Things most dogs never knew existed. What kind of object could shake him like this? What memory could be strong enough to override years of training and discipline? Claire crouched beside Ranger, her voice low and steady. Easy, buddy. Easy. The dog's body trembled again, muscles straining against stillness. Then he steadied himself with visible effort, the way a person might steady themselves after hearing news that changed everything. He looked at Claire for the first time in minutes, and something in that gaze, dark, intelligent pleading, hit her like a fist to the sternum. Not go, not stop, but remember. Claire swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat. Okay, she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. Okay, I hear you. The moment passed, but it left a mark. Something had cracked open that couldn't be sealed again. Vern slowly closed the tin box, his movements careful as if putting away a ghost. Claire, he said, and the use of her first name felt significant, weighted. That disc, where exactly did you find it? Vern rubbed his beard, fingers rasping against grayed hair. Edge of the old marsh near the cattails. Same general direction as your Close Valley. He paused, then added quietly, I didn't tell the sheriff back then. Folks around here don't love strangers poking at old bones. Claire felt a cold thread run through her chest. So there's more than one piece. Vern's eyes narrowed. You saying you saw more? Claire didn't describe the bow. Not yet. She wasn't ready to put those words into a room where they could become rumor, where they could spread through a small town faster than she could control. Instead, she said carefully, I think there's something bigger. Vern held her gaze for a long moment, his light blue eyes reading her face the way he'd read the grain of the wood, looking for truth in the patterns most people missed. His voice softened. Claire, sometimes bigger don't mean better. Sometimes bigger means it's got more ways to hurt you. Claire's jaw tightened. I know. And that was the truth. She knew too well. She'd seen what happened when small problems became big ones, because no one wanted to look closely enough while there was still time to act. Vern slid the carved wood back into the evidence bag with careful hands. I'll do you a favor, he said. I'll look through my father's old notebooks. He kept records. Woodtype's local finds old maps people brought him when they wanted repairs or restorations done. Can't promise anything, but if there's a ship story around here, he might have scribbled something down. Claire nodded, relief mixing with gratitude. I'd appreciate that. Vern's eyes flicked to Ranger again. The dog had settled somewhat, but his posture stayed tense, like a man trying to stand calmly after hearing bad news he couldn't quite process yet. That dog of yours, Vern said quietly. He ain't just trained, he's carrying something. Claire's throat tightened. I think so too. Vern leaned closer, and for the first time he looked less like a carpenter and more like an old priest giving reluctant counsel. Animals don't forget the way we pretend to, he said. If he's reacting to that brass like it's personal, it means it's tied to something he lived through, something that marked him. He let the sentence hang there heavy as wet rope. Claire finished it silently in her mind. And if it's tied to something he lived through, it can happen again. She thanked Vern and left the workshop with Ranger close at her side, the dog moving carefully now, favoring his right hind leg just slightly. The morning had grown brighter, the lake throwing sharp flashes of light between the trees, but the brightness felt hollow somehow, performative, like the world was pretending nothing had changed when everything had. On the drive back toward the ranger station, Claire's mind kept circling one thought: Ranger's reaction to the brass disc. Not fear in the simple sense, recognition. The kind of recognition that came with trauma, with memory that had been buried but never truly gone. She thought about Daniel Carrion, Ranger's first handler. The man who'd trained him, trusted him, died beside him. The official report had said equipment failure during a maritime training exercise. Capsized vessel. Cold water. Recovery efforts unsuccessful. But what if there was more to it? What if the brass disc, the ship in the woods, the Northern Star were all pieces of something Daniel had known about? Something he'd been investigating when he died. The thought made her hands tighten on the steering wheel. That evening back at the cabin, Claire did something she'd been avoiding for months. She pulled Ranger's old service file from the bottom of her packed paperwork she hadn't opened since the Coast Guard had transferred the dog into her care. She'd avoided it the way a person avoided touching a scar to see if it still hurt. The file smelled faintly of dust and government ink, the particular scent of bureaucracy trying to reduce lives and deaths into manageable categories. Ranger lay at her feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed but not asleep. His ears twitched when she turned pages, responding to the soft rustle of paper, like it was a language he'd once spoken fluently. She skimmed training logs, deployment notes, commendations for successful searches and rescues. Ranger had pulled 12 people from water over his career. 12 lives that continued because of his nose, his stamina, his refusal to quit, even when conditions said it was time to give up. Then she reached a section labeled "Our Handler History." A name stared up at her from the page printed in the impersonal font of official records. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Joseph Carrion. Below it, a service record that read like poetry compressed into bullet points. Arctic water training, maritime operations, search and rescue specialist, certified canine handler, decorated for valor during a storm rescue off the coast of Maine, where he'd coordinated the safe recovery of 17 crew members from a sinking cargo vessel. And then at the bottom of the page, a line item that made Claire's breath catch. Status KIA. Training accident. Maritime operations, Northern Lakes region. Date October 14th, 2021. 3 years ago. Almost to the day. Claire's chest tightened. She looked down at Ranger. The dog didn't move, but his eyes opened fully now, dark and steady, watching her with the calm intensity of someone who already knew what she was about to discover. She turned the page and found the incident summary. Sparse details, the kind of report written by people who wanted facts without feelings. Training exercise involving watercraft recovery. Capsized vessel simulation. Officer Carrion entered water to demonstrate rescue technique. Equipment malfunction. Recovery efforts initiated within 2 minutes. Body located 4 hours later. Cause of death: drowning. Contributing factors: cold water immersion, possible entanglement. K9 Ranger present at scene. Attempted water entry restrained by training personnel. No injuries to K9. Psychological evaluation recommended. Claire read the last line 3 times. Psychological evaluation recommended. She closed the file with careful hands, as if it might shatter under rough treatment, and sat there in the quiet cabin, with only the sound of wind moving through pine trees and the faint creak of the wood stove cooling. Ranger shifted beside her, then rose slowly and placed his head on her knee. Not asking for comfort, offering it, or maybe asking her to understand something he couldn't say in words. Claire ran her hand along Ranger's shoulder, feeling the warmth of muscle and bone beneath fur. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Ranger's eyes stayed on her, patient and unwavering. Outside, the lake kept shining in the last light of day. The pines swayed gently. The world remained bright and indifferent to the small human griefs that accumulated like snow, quiet and cold and relentless. Inside, Claire understood something with sudden, painful clarity. Ranger hadn't led her toward a mystery for entertainment or curiosity. He had led her toward the place where an old failure still waited, patient and unfinished. Daniel Carrion had died in these northern lakes during a training exercise. His body had been found. But what if there was more to the story? What if he'd been investigating something before he died? What if the Northern Star wasn't just a forgotten wreck, but evidence of something Daniel had been trying to expose? And what if Ranger, who had been there when Daniel died, knew more than any report could capture? Claire closed her eyes and made herself a promise she didn't yet know how to keep. She would not be late again. Not for Daniel. Not for the 23 names on that list she'd found. Not for whatever truth the forest had been keeping for 40 years. The next morning arrived with a blue sky so clean, it felt almost insulting, as if the weather was deliberately pretending nothing difficult was about to happen. Claire stood in the ranger station parking lot, hands in the pockets of her field jacket, watching vehicles arrive one by one like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't asked to solve. First came Nora in the ranger truck, her blonde braid tight beneath her cap, freckles standing out against skin that had gone pale with either cold or tension. She moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd rather be doing anything else but knew duty didn't negotiate. Then Kate's unmarked SUV pulling in with the deliberate pace of law enforcement that had learned not to rush, but also not to waste time. Kate stepped out wearing the same plain clothes as before, badge visible, face composed into professional neutrality. And finally, a county vehicle. White truck with official seals on the doors. The driver emerged carrying a hard plastic equipment case in one hand and a tablet in the other. Dr. Calvin Rusk. He was tall and narrow-shouldered, maybe mid-40s, with pale skin that suggested he spent more time under fluorescent lights than sunlight. His hair was dark and thinning at the crown, combed back with the careful precision of someone who liked order and became uncomfortable when he couldn't find it. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He wore hiking boots that still looked new jeans and a dark windbreaker zipped up despite the mild morning. His expression held the mild irritation of a professional forced to do field work when he would rather be reading data on a screen in a climate-controlled office. Dr. Rusk, Kate said, making introductions with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times. This is Claire Ashford, Trail Ranger, and Nora Hale, Site Supervisor. Rusk nodded to each of them, his gaze polite but distant. Then his eyes dropped to Ranger, who sat at Claire's side with perfect discipline, black and tan coat gleaming in morning light. And this is Ranger, Claire said, retired K9. Rusk gave a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm more of a data person than a dogs person. Ranger stared back, unmoved by labels or credentials. He didn't care about degrees. He cared about truth. They moved as a group toward the closure sign, boots crunching on gravel, radios crackling with occasional check-ins from other personnel scattered across the forest. The morning air was cool and carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth, clean and innocent, as if the ground beneath them wasn't holding secrets 4 decades old. Kate stopped them at the barrier tape. Let's be clear about protocol, she said, her voice firm. Dr. Rusk evaluates from safe distance. No one crosses into the soft zone. No one takes risks. We document, we assess, we make decisions based on facts, not speculation. Claire nodded, but her gaze drifted past the tape toward the hidden valley where the northern star waited in patient silence. Ranger's body tensed beside her, and she felt the leash grow taut as the dog's attention locked onto something only he could sense. Dr. Rusk opened his equipment case with the careful movements of a surgeon preparing for an operation. He pulled out a metal probe, a compact measuring device that looked like a modified depth finder, and a coil of bright yellow flagging tape. He worked with quiet confidence, the kind that came from trusting instruments more than instinct. As he took readings near the boundary, his frown deepened. Water saturated, he muttered mostly to himself. Void pockets beneath the surface, likely kettle depression feeding into peat layers. He jabbed the probe into different spots, watching digital readouts on his tablet with narrowed eyes. Load-bearing capacity here is unreliable at best. Nora exhaled through her nose. In English, Rusk glanced up, slightly offended that his technical language wasn't universally understood. The ground can swallow you, he said flatly. Kate nodded once as if that translation satisfied her completely. Rusk traced the boundary with his yellow flagging, tape-setting bright markers that looked absurdly cheerful against the dark earth and autumn undergrowth. This area shifts seasonally, he explained, his voice taking on the rhythm of a lecture he'd given before. Spring thaw, heavy rains, even significant temperature changes can alter the stability. If something heavy is sitting in there, rocks, fallen trees, debris, those shifts can expose or bury it depending on water table fluctuations. Claire's mind snagged on his words. Expose or bury. That wasn't just geology. That was a mechanism, a process. The woods breathing just like Vern's father had said, sighing up the past when conditions were right. Ranger's nails scraped softly against dirt. The dog didn't whine, didn't bark. He simply shifted his weight, restless, as if time itself were an itch under his skin that he couldn't scratch away. Claire placed a steadying hand on Ranger's shoulder, feeling the muscle beneath the fur pulled tight with tension. Kate watched Claire's hand, then looked at her face. You're somewhere else, she observed quietly. Claire forced herself back into the present moment. I'm here. Kate's expression remained flat, but her voice softened by half a degree. I've seen that look. People who survive certain kinds of work, they live in two timelines. 1 foot in now, 1 foot in then. Claire didn't answer. She didn't trust what would come out if she did. Nora studied the flags and markers Dr. Rusk had placed, her hazel eyes moving across the terrain with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent years learning to read danger in landscape. So we keep it closed, she said finally. Locked down, monitored, maybe add fencing. Rusk nodded, packing his equipment with quick, precise movements. Closed fenced if budget allows, and periodic surveying, at minimum quarterly assessments to track any ground movement. He adjusted his glasses. The peat can liquefy under stress. You do not want anyone stepping into a depression when that happens. Kate folded her arms, a gesture that looked casual, but Claire recognized as defensive. Which is why I'm here, Kate said. People don't listen to science. They listen to consequences. Claire's gaze drifted toward the trees again, toward the unseen shape of the northern star, resting in its grave of mud and time. She could feel it out there like a low hum in her bones. Something waiting, something patient. Kate followed Claire's gaze, and her jaw tightened with something that might have been frustration or might have been fear wearing a professional mask. You're thinking about going back in? It wasn't a question. No, Claire said. Then more honestly, not without proper cause. Kate's eyes held her steady. Define proper cause. Claire thought about the 23 names on that list. Maria Santos, the others whose identities she hadn't yet traced. People who had boarded a ship 40 years ago hoping for passage to something better and had never arrived. Evidence of human remains, Claire said quietly. That would be proper cause. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel like weight pressing down on all of them. Dr. Rusk cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotional temperature rising around a discussion that should have been purely technical. From a geological standpoint, he said carefully, the probability of successful retrieval in saturated peat decreases exponentially after initial entrapment. Stop, Nora said, her voice sharp, not angry at him exactly. Angry at the coldness of mathematics, trying to describe human loss. Just stop. Rusk blinked, then nodded stiffly and returned his attention to his tablet. Ranger took one step forward, then stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. His ears angled forward, his eyes narrowed, and for just a moment Claire saw something in the dog's posture that made her chest tighten with recognition. He looked like a soldier standing at attention before a memorial. Present, devoted, unable to leave until the names were read. Kate stepped closer to Claire, her voice dropping low enough that only Claire could hear. Whatever you're carrying from before, she said quietly, don't try to fix it here by dying in a bog. Claire's throat tightened. Not my plan. Kate's gaze slid to Ranger, who stood like a statue carved from purpose and grief. Your dog seems to think time matters. Claire looked down at her partner, at the way Ranger's body leaned subtly toward the trees even while he obeyed the leash. He wasn't frantic. He was intent, like a person staring at a closing door and calculating whether they could reach it before it locked. Yeah, Claire said softly. I think he does. And somewhere in the forest buried beneath 40 years of silence and mud, and the careful forgetting that small towns did, when truth became inconvenient, the Northern Star waited for someone to finally ask the right questions. The storm didn't arrive like a shout. It arrived like a decision. Quiet at first, then absolute. By mid-afternoon, the sky over the lake had turned the color of old iron. The sunlight that usually made the water shine went dull and flat, as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the world and forgotten to take it back. Wind pushed through the pines in uneasy waves, bending branches and making needles hiss warnings against each other in a language older than human speech. Claire stood on the porch of her cabin, one hand resting on the doorframe, watching the tree line darken like a bruise spreading beneath skin. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an hour. The air tasted like copper and ozone, the particular flavor of weather that didn't negotiate. The dive watch on her wrist showed 3:47 in the afternoon, but the light outside suggested evening had arrived early and brought violence with it. Ranger sat at her feet, black and tan coat bristling slightly, as wind carried scents that didn't belong to autumn. Rain, wet earth, and something a deeper, older, like a mouth opening in the ground somewhere distant but approaching. Claire had learned to respect weather the way she respected silence. Both could kill you without raising their voice. Both gave warnings if you knew how to listen. And right now, the forest was screaming in a frequency most people couldn't hear, but working dogs understood perfectly. Her radio crackled to life, breaking the tense quiet. All units, this is Ranger Station Dispatch. We have a check-in failure. 2 hikers overdue from scheduled return. Last known location, North Section Loop Trail near the closure boundary. Claire's jaw tightened. Her hand moved to the radio on instinct, fingers wrapping around the mic as her pulse kicked up a notch. Near the closure boundary meant near the valley. Near the valley meant the ground that could swallow a person without leaving evidence behind. She keyed the mic. Ashford copies. Any names on the overdue party? A pause as someone shuffled papers, the sound coming through as soft static. Margaret and Thomas Garrett, older couple, volunteer trail maintenance, last seen at junction marker 7 around 1100 hours this morning. Claire's stomach dropped. She remembered them. 2 days ago at the trail junction, she'd crossed paths with a couple who looked like they belonged in a gentler story. Margaret Garrett had been in her late 60s, short and sturdy, with silver hair pulled back under a bright yellow knit cap that clashed cheerfully with the muted forest colors. Her face carried the soft lines of someone who smiled easily, even when her knees complained about the terrain. Thomas Garrett was taller and lean, but not fragile, with a sun-browned face and a white mustache that made him look perpetually amused by some private joke. He'd carried a walking stick carved from birch, using it more for style than support, and when he'd waved at Claire, he'd said something about the weather looking moody. Margaret had laughed and added, "We'll be back before it decides to throw a tantrum." Thomas had grinned. "We've been hiking these trails since before you were born, Ranger. We know when to turn around." Claire had smiled in her dry, careful way and told them to stay safe. She'd watched them head north on the loop trail, 2 people who moved with the confidence of experience, who believed their knowledge of the woods was enough to keep them protected. Now the weather had thrown its tantrum, and they weren't back. Nora's voice cut in next, sharp with urgency and the particular tension of someone whose job was preventing exactly this kind of emergency. "Deputy Brennan is mobilizing search personnel. Claire, do not enter the restricted depression. Repeat, do not enter. Stay on marked trails. We're assembling a team now." Claire looked down at Ranger. The dog had already risen to his feet, posture locked into the alert stance of a working canine who just received orders only he could hear. His ears were forward, body angled toward the door, like a compass needle pointing toward purpose. Ranger wasn't frantic. He was ready. The kind of ready that didn't wait for permission or procedure or the careful risk assessments that kept lawyers comfortable. Claire's throat tightened. Her instincts pulled in 2 directions. Half of her wanted to follow protocol, wait for the official team, let people with the right equipment and authorization handle the search the way systems were designed to handle emergencies. The other half remembered standing on a helicopter deck 8 years ago, watching the fuel gauge drop while a man drowned 15 feet below the surface because she'd chosen the safe window instead of the necessary risk. She lifted the radio to her mouth. "Ranger Station Ashford, I'm closest to last known position. Moving to junction marker 7 to establish baseline and assess conditions. Will remain outside restricted boundaries." She clipped the mic off before anyone could argue, but the words felt like a lie she couldn't guarantee. A promise made to procedure while instinct was already calculating how far into danger she'd be willing to go if the moment demanded it. Rain began as a soft tapping on the cabin roof, then thickened into a hard, cold curtain that turned the lake into something formless and gray. Trees blurred into shadows. The trail ahead disappeared behind sheets of water that fell with the weight of something that had been held back too long and finally released. Claire grabbed her pack, checked her knife, tightened her bootlaces with hands that moved through the familiar motions without conscious thought. Not because she wanted to play hero, because she knew what happened when you lost minutes to indecision. Because minutes were the difference between rescue and recovery, between bringing someone home and bringing back a story about how hard everyone had tried. Ranger waited at the door, a silent question in his dark eyes. Claire opened it. "All right," she murmured. "We go." They reached the trail junction in less than 15 minutes, the wind shoving them sideways the whole way. Mud formed instantly underfoot the dry autumn ground, turning slick and treacherous, as water overwhelmed the forest's ability to absorb it. At the junction, Kate's SUV was already there, parked at an angle that suggested speed more than care. Deputy Kate Brennan stood near the closure sign, drenched, her dark hair plastered against her skull, radio in one hand and a high-powered flashlight in the other, even though sunset was still an hour away. The storm had made its own evening thick and premature. Nora arrived moments later in the Ranger truck, blonde braids slick against her jacket, freckles standing out starkly on skin, gone pale with cold or stress, or both. Her eyes flashed with the kind of controlled anger that came from caring too much about outcomes she couldn't control. Kate acknowledged Claire with a sharp nod. "Garrett's," she said, voice cutting through rain and wind. "Any signal from their phones?" Nora shook her head, water streaming off her cap. "No ping, no response to calls. Either dead batteries or they're in a dead zone." Kate's mouth tightened into a line that looked carved from stone. "Or they're in the depression where signal doesn't reach and the ground doesn't let go." Claire scanned the area, eyes moving across familiar terrain made unfamiliar by weather. The closure sign ahead looked smaller in the rain, less like authority, and more like a polite suggestion the forest had already ignored. Water poured off the orange notice in streams, washing away any illusion that warnings could stop determined people from making fatal mistakes. Ranger pulled gently at the leash, then stopped and lowered his head, sniffing the wet ground with the focused intensity of a professional working through difficult conditions. His tail stayed low and steady, not wagging, not tucked, just present, operational. Kate raised her radio. "Search team ETA is 10 minutes. We hold position until they arrive with proper gear." But even as she said it, Claire saw doubt flicker across Kate's face. 10 minutes in cold rain. 10 minutes for two people in their 60s who might be injured, hypothermic, trapped in saturated ground that pulled heat from bodies faster than hearts could pump it back. 10 minutes could be the difference. Ranger stopped near a patch of disturbed earth at the trail edge, just before the boundary where maintained path met wild forest. He pawed lightly at the ground, careful, and controlled no frantic digging. Just enough pressure to indicate something mattered here. Claire crouched beside him and saw it. A scrap of yellow fabric snagged on a thorn bush, fluttering in the wind like a small, desperate flag. Margaret's hat, part of it anyway. Bright, cheerful yellow, now darkened by rain and mud. Claire's stomach dropped. She touched the fabric gently, felt the dampness that meant it had been here a while, exposed to weather. Warmth had long since left it. "Kate," she called. The deputy was beside her in 3 strides, flashlight beam cutting through rain to illuminate the yellow scrap. Kate's jaw clenched visibly. "That's Margaret Garrett's. She was wearing it 2 days ago when I saw her at the general store." Nora joined them, staring at the fabric like it was evidence of a crime the forest had committed. "They went off trail," she said quietly. "Not accusation, just terrible understanding." Ranger didn't wait for discussion. He moved forward again, nose to the air now, rather than the ground, tracking scent despite rain that tried to erase everything. The shepherd's focus had shifted, becoming more urgent without losing discipline. He knew something. He'd found something. And he needed Claire to understand before time made understanding irrelevant. Thunder rolled overhead, not loud at first, then suddenly close enough to make Claire feel the vibration in her teeth. A gust of wind tore through the trees with force that bent smaller pines nearly horizontal. And somewhere deeper in the forest, something cracked. A heavy sound, wood breaking under too much pressure, too much history, too much weight accumulated over decades. Claire froze, head snapping toward the sound. Ranger's ears locked onto it as well, his entire body going rigid. Another crack, louder. Then a groan, long and low and terrible, like a giant animal shifting in pain. It had endured too long in silence. A pine, one of the tallest, tilted in the wind. Its roots, loosened by saturated soil, lifted like fingers, trying to hold on to earth that had turned to liquid beneath them. The tree fell not straight down, but sideways, dragged by the slope, sliding toward the hidden depression where the northern star waited in its grave. Claire didn't see the impact. She heard it. A deep, hollow sound, wood hitting wood, followed by a splintering collapse that echoed through the rain like something ancient, finally giving way to entropy. Ranger lunged forward. Claire's hand tightened on the leash. No, but Ranger wasn't charging blindly. The dog darted along the edge of the restricted zone with purpose, then stopped abruptly, paws skidding in mud, as if he'd found the exact line between rescue and suicide. He stood there, body trembling, with restraint, staring into the trees. Claire's boots slipped. The ground beneath her right foot softened, gave way by inches. Her heart slammed. She had time to think one clear thought. This is how it happens. Then the earth shifted again, and Claire's foot sank deeper mud, sucking at her boot, like a hand trying to pull her down into depths that had been waiting 40 years for someone to make this exact mistake. Ranger whipped around and clamped his jaws onto Claire's jacket sleeve. Not tearing, not panicking. Gripping with trained precision. He leaned back, muscles straining, pulling Claire away from the soft edge with the steady force of a winch that refused to accept failure. Claire threw her weight backward, digging her left boot into firmer ground. Mud tried to steal her right boot completely. She fought the suction breath, harsh rain cold against her face. Ranger pulled once, twice steady as machinery giving her the leverage she needed. Her boot ripped free with a wet, violent pop. She stumbled backward and hit the ground hard, wind knocked out of her. Mud caked her pants. Her ribs ached where the leash had caught her during the pull. Ranger stood over her, panting, eyes wide but controlled. Not celebrating, not relieved, just confirming she was safe before returning attention to what mattered. Claire sucked in air. "Good boy," she rasped. "Good." The shepherd's ears twitched. A sound faint, almost swallowed by rain and wind and the endless noise of water trying to drown every other frequency. A voice. Not close but there. Claire pushed herself up, hard hammering. She lifted her head. "Hello?" Nothing. Then again. Faint. A cough. A weak call that had traveled too far and lost most of its strength along the way. "Help!" Not a shout. A whisper that had somehow survived the storm. Claire's chest tightened. "Kate." "I heard it," Kate said, already moving, already keying her radio. "All units, we have possible victim contact. Location east perimeter of restricted zone. Requesting immediate assistance." Static crackled, then a voice breaking up through interference. "Copy. Team is 3 minutes out. Do not enter the zone. Repeat, do not enter." 3 minutes. Claire's mind did the math automatically. 3 minutes for people who might be injured, who might be in water, who might be losing core temperature. With every second that passed, while help calculated acceptable risk and weighed liability against human life. She looked at Ranger. The dog's gaze was locked on the tree's body, coiled with the terrible tension of someone who knew what needed to be done and was being forced to wait while seconds bled away into the kind of loss that haunted you forever. Claire stood slowly, testing her weight, making sure nothing was sprained or broken. She was intact, muddy shaken but intact. She looked at Kate. The deputy's face showed the war between duty and human decency, between procedure that kept people safe and compassion that sometimes demanded risk. "I'm going to the edge," Claire said quietly. "Just to the edge, to confirm location and assess." Kate's hand shot out, gripping Claire's arm. "You do that, and if you slip, we're searching for 3 bodies instead of 2. Claire met her eyes. "I won't slip." "You don't know that." "I know that if I don't try, I'll hear that voice for the rest of my life, wondering if 3 minutes would have mattered." Kate's grip tightened, then released. "Stay on visible ground," she said finally. "You feel anything give way, you stop. That's an order." Claire nodded once, then moved. She followed the path Ranger had traced, boots testing each step, weight distributed carefully, eyes scanning for soft spots and hollow ground. Rain made everything treacherous. Mud sucked at her soles. Exposed roots turned slick as ice. Ranger stayed close to her left side, not pulling, but guiding, showing her where his paws had found purchase, where the earth still held enough integrity to support weight. They reached the edge where maintained forest met wild descent. Claire dropped to one knee using a sturdy pine trunk for anchor and leaned forward just enough to see down the slope. The depression had changed. The fallen tree had crashed into the valley, its trunk now lying across the hidden shape of the northern star, like a bridge connecting past and present. Entangled in the branches near the base, barely visible through rain and failing light, were 2 figures. Margaret and Thomas Garrett, trapped. One of them moving weakly, the other completely still. "I see them," Claire called back to Kate. 2 victims, approximately 40 feet down the slope. One appears responsive, one non-responsive. "They're caught in fallen timber." Kate was beside her, instantly flashlight adding its beam to the gray chaos. "Can you reach them?" Claire assessed the angle, the distance, the way water was already pooling around the base of the tree. "Not from here, not without rope and anchor points." "Then we wait for the team." But even as Kate said it, Claire saw the problem. The water was rising, not fast but steady, pooling around the Garrett's legs, creeping higher. In 3 minutes, it would be at their waists. In 5, it might be at their chests. Cold water didn't need to drown you to kill you. It just needed time. Ranger let out a sound Claire had never heard him make before, Forsun. Low, broken, a whine that vibrated with something beyond distress. It sounded like grief trying to speak, like memory forcing its way through training and discipline to say the thing that mattered most. "Not again. Please, not again." Claire looked at the Chiang, at the way his gaze fixed on the water rising around the trapped couple, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity what he was seeing. Not Margaret and Thomas Garrett, Daniel Carrion, his handler, his partner, trapped in water that rose while help calculated risk and weighed options and chose the safe delay. She'd made that choice once, 8 years ago. The correct decision that had led to a man drowning while she watched fuel gauges and ran numbers that said waiting was wisdom. She looked down at the Garretts, at Margaret, who'd laughed about weather and believed experience would keep her safe, At Thomas, who wasn't moving, whose time might already be measured in seconds rather than minutes. She thought about Daniel Carrion, who died while Ranger watched from shore, restrained by hands that meant well, but held back the only help that mattered. And she made a different choice. "I'm going down," she said. Kate's hand shot out again. "Claire, no. I'm going to the tree. I can stabilize them until the team arrives. Keep them out of the water. You don't have gear. You don't have backup." Claire pulled the coil of paracord from her pack, the 550-pound test line she carried for emergency repairs and had never expected to use for this. "I have 50 feet of line and a dog who knows what he's doing." She tied one end around her waist with the knots muscle memory had preserved from years of Coast Guard training. She tied the other end to the pine trunk, testing the bark for stability, finding purchase where roots ran deep. "If I go down, pull me back," she said. "But I'm not watching someone drown because I was too afraid to tree mom." Kate's face showed every objection procedure demanded, but her voice when it came was quiet. 30 seconds. You get 30 seconds to assess. Then I pull you back, whether you're ready or not." Claire nodded. "Fair." She looked at Ranger. "Stay." The dog's body trembled, every instinct screaming at him to follow, to help, to not let another person go into water alone. But he sat obedient, trusting her the way she was trusting herself. Claire tested her weight on the slope. The ground held. She took another step, feeling mud slide beneath her boot, but finding friction before she lost balance. Another step. Another. Rain hammered down, turning everything into gray chaos. She could hear Kate behind her counting seconds aloud like a prayer. 10, 15, 20. Claire reached the fallen tree trunk. It was massive ancient pine, still heavy with needles and sap, lying across the depression like a fallen bridge. She grabbed it with both hands, testing stability. It shifted slightly but held. She pulled herself along at boots, finding purchase on bark slick with rain until she could see the Garretts clearly. Margaret was conscious barely. Her eyes were open, but unfocused skin, pale lips blue with cold. She was wedged between branches, one arm trapped, water up to her waist now. Thomas was worse. He lay against the tree base, head lolled to one side, water lapping at his chest. Not moving, not responding. "Margaret," Claire called, projecting her voice through the storm. "Can you hear me?" Margaret's eyes found her recognition, flickering like a candle in wind. "Cold," she whispered. "Thomas won't wake up." "Help is coming," Claire said, already moving. "I'm going to shift these branches. Keep you out of the water." She braced herself against the trunk and pushed at the branch, pinning Margaret's arm. It moved half an inch, then stopped. Claire pushed harder, boots slipping on wet wood, muscles straining. Behind her, Kate's voice cut through the rain. 30 seconds, Claire." "Almost there," Claire grunted. The branch gave way suddenly. Margaret gasped as her arm came free, then Claire was pulling her up onto the trunk out of the water that wanted to claim her. "Thomas," Margaret sobbed. "Please, Thomas." Claire turned to the man. No pulse at the neck she could feel through cold and rain. No visible breathing. But she'd been wrong before about who was savable and who wasn't. She grabbed Thomas under the arms and hauled him onto the trunk with strength born from refusal more than capability. His body was heavy, waterlogged, limp. She rolled him onto his side, tilted his head back, checked for airway obstruction. Water came out, not much, but some. "Breathe," she commanded, as if her voice alone could restart what cold had stopped. And then the ground beneath the tree shifted. Not much, just a settling a sigh as saturated earth compressed under weight it could no longer support. But enough to send Claire's boots sliding enough to make the paracord around her waist snap taut with sudden tension. Kate was pulling, hard. The line bit into Claire's ribs as she was dragged backward across the trunk, away from the Garretts. Away from water that was rising faster now, freed by the ground's collapse to claim what it had been reaching for. "No," Claire gasped, grabbing at branches trying to hold position. "I've got them, just give me—" But Kate wasn't listening to negotiation. She pulled with the strength of someone who'd watched too many rescues turn into recoveries, because heroes couldn't recognize when saving yourself was the only option that mattered. Claire slid back up the slope, boots scrambling for purchase, until she cleared the soft zone and collapsed onto firmer ground, gasping drenched rope burns across her ribs, where the paracord had held her against gravity and mud. Ranger was there instantly, pressing against her side, not celebrating, not relieved, just present, solid, real. And down in the depression, Margaret Garrett clung to the tree trunk, crying while Thomas lay still beside her, and water kept rising with the patience of something that had waited 40 years and could wait 40 more if necessary. But it didn't have to wait, Because 3 minutes had passed and the search team arrived with ropes and harnesses and bright lights that cut through rain to turn catastrophe into something manageable, something procedure could handle. They pulled Margaret up first, efficient and professional, wrapping her in thermal blankets and rushing her toward the waiting ambulance that had appeared at the trailhead with lights flashing red and blue against darkening sky. Then they pulled Thomas. CPR started immediately, compressions and rescue breathing performed by people who knew the rhythm of life being coaxed back into bodies that had decided to quit. Claire watched from the edge, shivering now, adrenaline fading into exhaustion and cold. Kate stood beside her, silent, not offering comfort or criticism, just witness. After 5 minutes of work, one of the paramedics looked up and shook his head, not at Claire, at the universe. At the terrible mathematics of cold water and time and choices made seconds too late to matter. Thomas Garrett was gone. The rain stopped an hour later as suddenly as it had begun. The forest dripped in the aftermath, water falling from needles and branches in soft rhythms that sounded almost peaceful if you didn't think too hard about what had just happened. Claire sat in her truck with the heater running, Ranger on the passenger seat, both of them drying slowly. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. Her breathing had returned to something close to normal. Kate knocked on the window. Claire rolled it down. "Margaret's stable," Kate said. "Hypothermic, traumatized, but she'll survive." A pause. "You did what you could." Claire nodded but didn't speak. That sentence never helped. It never had. Kate leaned against the truck, looking more tired than Claire had ever seen her. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., my office. We need to talk about next steps." "Next step, Summers. Donovan Hale called me an hour ago, wants to file a complaint about you trespassing on his property. Wants your contract reviewed." Kate's jaw tightened. "He's making a move. We need to make ours." Claire met her eyes. "What do you have in mind?" "Meet me tomorrow. Bring everything you've found, and bring that dog." Kate's gaze shifted to Ranger. "I think it's time we stopped playing by rules that only protect people like Hale." She walked away before Claire could respond. Claire drove back to the cabin through darkness, windshield wipers beating a rhythm against residual mist. When she arrived, she fed Ranger, checked his leg again, where old injury and new strain had combined, and gave him medicine wrapped in cheese he accepted without enthusiasm. Then she sat at the small table and opened her laptop. She didn't sleep. She worked. By dawn, she'd found what she needed. Old news archives. A shipping manifest buried in maritime records. An accident report from 1984 that mentioned a vessel called Northern Star losing contact during a storm investigation pending case eventually closed due to lack of evidence. 23 names listed as missing, presumed drowned. No bodies recovered, no families compensated. Just a notation that the vessel's owner, Hale Maritime Services, had ceased operations shortly after the incident. Richard Hale, Donovan's father, had buried more than a ship in those woods. He'd buried evidence, buried truth, buried people who'd paid passage hoping for work and found cold water instead. And his son was still covering it up 40 years later. Claire's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Ashford, we need to talk. Pier 9, 7 p.m. tonight. Come alone, or custody arrangements become very complicated for you." Her blood went cold. She called Kate immediately. "He's threatening Lily." "Expected," Kate said grimly. "He's desperate? Good. We use that. You go to the meeting, but you wear a camera, small one hidden, and you get him talking. Once he admits anything, threatens anything on record, we have leverage. And if he doesn't talk, then tomorrow we hold that memorial you mentioned. Make everything public. Let the town decide who they believe." Claire looked at Ranger, who sat watching her with dark eyes that had seen too much loss and were tired of watching help arrive too late. "All right," she said. "Let's finish this." The day stretched long and tense. Claire prepared carefully. She borrowed a small camera from Kate, the kind that clipped to a jacket button and looked like nothing. She tested it 3 times to make sure it worked. At 6:30, she drove toward Pier 9 with Ranger beside her, knowing Kate would be watching from a distance, knowing this was either the moment justice caught up with Donovan Hale or the moment he buried the truth so deep no one would ever dig it up again. The sun was setting as she arrived, turning the lake to copper and shadow. The old pier stretched into water like a finger pointing at something just beyond reach. Donovan Hale stood at the far end, silhouetted against the dying light, wearing an expensive coat that looked absurd in this setting of rot and ruin. He turned as she approached. Mid-60s silver hair, perfectly styled face that had learned to smile at cameras while calculating how to destroy obstacles. "Miss Ashford," he said, voice smooth, cultured, carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Thank you for coming. Claire stopped 10 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to run. Where's my daughter? Safe. At her school, where she'll remain safe as long as you make intelligent choices. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but eyes cold. You've been asking questions, digging into things that don't concern you. Claire's hand moved subtly, activating the camera hidden in her jacket. The Northern Star concerns me. 23 people died. An unfortunate accident 40 years ago. Nothing to do with me. Your father owned the vessel. He buried the ship to hide what happened. Donovan's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. My father made a business decision. The ship encountered a storm. It capsized. He salvaged what he could and moved on. That's not a crime. He didn't report it. He didn't recover the bodies. He let 23 families spend 40 years wondering what happened to people they loved. Speculation. You have no proof. I have the ship. I have the passenger manifest. I have witness testimony from a survivor. Donovan's expression flickered. Just for a second. Surprise. Fear. Then the mask returned. A survivor. Interesting fantasy, but even if such a person existed, their testimony about events 40 years ago would be questionable at best. Her name is Faye Garrett. She was 6 years old. She watched your father's crew abandon 23 people to drown. Donovan stepped very close now, voice dropping. And I have lawyers who will bury you in litigation until you're bankrupt. I have friends in the county office who will revoke your work permits. I have connections to family court judges who will ensure you never see Lily unsupervised again. His smile widened. You're a failed Coast Guard officer with PTSD who couldn't even keep her marriage together. Who's going to believe you over me? Claire met his eyes steadily. 347 people watching this live stream right now. That's who. She pulled out her phone, showing him the screen. The camera wasn't just recording. It was broadcasting live to the county Facebook group, the one with 5,000 members, the one where everyone in 3 counties saw everything that mattered. Donovan's face went white. He lunged for the phone, but Ranger, who'd been sitting quietly in the shadows, exploded forward with a snarl that made Donovan stumble backward, arms raised defensively. The shepherd positioned himself between Claire and Donovan, teeth bared, every muscle coiled and ready. Kate's SUV roared into the parking area, lights flashing. 2 county sheriff vehicles right behind her, sirens cutting through the evening quiet. Donovan, hail, Kate called, stepping out with badge displayed and 3 deputies flanking her. You're under arrest for criminal threats, obstruction of justice, and destruction of evidence related to the 1984 Northern Star incident. You have the right to remain silent. The arrest was clean, public, recorded by a dozen phones that had appeared as word spread through town that something was happening at Pier 9, that the Hale family's decades of silence were finally cracking open under lights that couldn't be turned off. By the time they loaded Donovan into the sheriff's vehicle, the live stream had been viewed over 2,000 times and shared across 3 counties. The truth, once released, couldn't be buried again. 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. County officials authorized excavation of the Northern Star. Forensic teams worked with reverence and precision, recovering 19 sets of remains from mud that had held them for 40 years. DNA testing would take months, but families who'd spent decades wondering finally had answers beginning to form. Claire stood beside a simple wooden memorial Vern had built near the lake, a structure of weathered cedar with a brass bell mounted at the center. The same bell she'd found that first day after the storm, cleaned and polished, hung where wind could make it sing. Below it, a bronze plaque listed 23 names: workers, immigrants, people who'd paid passage hoping for better lives and found cold water instead. Margaret Garrett stood beside Claire, leaning on a cane, her face lined with grief for Thomas, but also something like peace. Thank you, she whispered, for trying, for him. Claire's phone buzzed, a message from her lawyer. Judge-approved modified custody. You have Lily every weekend and Wednesday dinners, effective immediately. She looked down at Ranger, who sat calmly beside her, his injured leg finally healed, eyes clear and focused. The dog had led her here for a reason, not randomly, not by accident, to finish what Daniel Carrion had started, to bring home the people who'd been lost, to prove that arriving late was still better than never arriving at all. A young girl appeared at the edge of the gathering, 12 years old, blonde hair in a ponytail, uncertain smile. Lily, Claire's ex-husband, stood behind her, nodded once in acknowledgement, then walked away to give them space. Mom, Lily said quietly. Claire knelt and wrapped her arms around her daughter, feeling warmth and realness and the particular miracle of second chances. You didn't think you deserved but received anyway because sometimes grace showed up wearing ordinary clothes and didn't announce itself with trumpets. Ranger padded over and sat beside them, patient and present, his dark eyes reflecting light from the setting sun. The bell rang once in the wind, clear and bright, carrying across water that had held secrets and now held only light. Lily looked up at the memorial, reading the names. Are these the people you found? Yes. Were they scared? Claire thought about that, about cold water and darkness and the terrible moment when hope gives way to understanding that no one is coming. Probably, she said honestly, but they're not alone anymore. People know their names now. People remember. Lily was quiet for a moment, then she looked at Ranger. Can I pet him? He'd like that. Lily reached out carefully, running her hand along Ranger's shoulders. The dog leaned into the touch, accepting comfort he rarely asked for, offering the same in return. Claire stood with her daughter and her dog beside a memorial to 23 people who'd finally come home, and for the first time in 8 years, she felt something close to peace. Not because she'd saved everyone, she hadn't. Thomas Garrett was still gone. Daniel Carrion was still gone. The man she'd failed to rescue 8 years ago was still gone. But she'd tried. She'd shown up. She'd refused to let the story stay buried just because digging was hard and dangerous and might not end the way anyone wanted. The Northern Star rested now beneath earth and memory, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. Its bell hung in the wind as witness and memorial, ringing softly when weather moved through the pines, carrying the names of the lost across water that reflected sky and light, and the promise that some stories, no matter how long they wait, eventually find their ending. Claire walked with Lily toward the parking area as sunset painted the lake in shades of gold and amber. Ranger moved beside them, limping slightly but steady. His purpose fulfilled, his vigil complete. Behind them, the bell rang once more, and the sound carried across still water like a voice finally given permission to speak, like truth finally allowed to surface, like justice arriving exactly when it was supposed to, even if that meant 40 years late. Sometimes the rescue came after the disaster. Sometimes help arrived too late to save everyone, but just in time to honor them. Sometimes a woman and her dog just needed to be brave enough to keep walking toward the sound of the bell until they found what had been lost, until they finished what someone else had started, until they proved that the past could be honored even when it couldn't be changed. And sometimes that was enough.